Well, I'm going to be talking about the issue of climate change out here in Studio City Park. And as you can see, many people who are around here are more than 6 feet away from me, which is why I'm not wearing this mask at the moment. But of course, I would put it on if it became more crowded. So anyway, on the question of how urgent climate action is, on the question of on the question of whether humans should try to reduce greenhouse gases as much as we can, there are greenhouse gas emissions as much as we can. There are really three schools of thought. The first could be euphemistically called the minimalist school of thought, or the optimistic school of thought. The climate optimists hold that either we don't need to do anything because climate change just isn't real, or they claim that climate change is not driven by human activity, or that most of it is not driven by human activity. Or they claim that climate change is indeed driven by human activity. It is very real, but its impacts are so much less severe than this consensus would have you believe, that again, we can manage without reducing our emissions now through any policies. Some emissions might go down just through markets being left to their own devices, and they cite specific instances where in one country one kind of gas might have gone down in 1 year. They cherry pick to make that case. And then, we don't need to have any policy in place until things get a bit worse. They won't get nearly as bad as we're told by the IPCC, and once they get however bad they will get, we can just adapt without having taken any steps at this point. Now, that is the most scientifically informed version of the minimalist or optimistic position. That is the most, that's really the strongest version of the climate optimists' view. Then we have those of us like me who could be called part of the action-oriented camp. We may disagree on exactly which actions need to be taken, but we do agree on the need for some kind of action, for some kind of policy or set of policies that are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In my view, this would also include two other objectives. Getting to a point where we can generate significant negative emissions, and also getting to a point where we are prepared to adapt to whatever impacts will still happen even once we have dramatically lowered our emissions and begun generating what are called negative emissions. So that's the second school of thought on the issue of climate action. The third school of thought on the issue of climate action, and also a brief overview of my own strain of it, I guess. The third school of thought on this question is interesting because it has more in common with the action-oriented school on the question of how bad the problem is, but it also has more in common with the optimist school on the question of what we need to be doing. So this school of thought could be called the climate fatalism school. Basically, climate fatalists believe that we have already done it to ourselves. The damage is done. We've had many chances to avert the situation that we now find ourselves in. But many of the worst impacts are already locked in, and even if some of them are not, we will not have the political capacity to take action quickly or rapidly enough to avert any of the remaining worst case scenario impacts that could still be avoided. So there's that version of the fatalist argument, and then there is the really dreary fatalist argument, which is just, sorry, but we've already done it to ourselves. Scientifically, we really do lack any ability to solve the problem at this point with mitigation, with greenhouse gas reductions. And the entire emphasis might be on adaptation, but even that might not be feasible. So it's just, get ready, essentially. That position has a very large burden of proof. In some ways, it might even have a higher burden of proof than the optimistic or minimalist position. The minimalists have to prove that the science is wrong. What the pessimists have to, and what the fatalists in particular have to prove, is that the science is so accurate that we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, really, that there is nothing we can do to deal with the potentially existential problem. Because if you think about it, with other existential problems, there isn't always certainty that doing X will result in Y. With a number of other existential threats, we don't know about, whether, let's say there's a comet that's heading towards Earth, and we know that it is large enough, it is traveling at a speed that is fast enough that if it impacted Earth, there's a very good chance that, best case scenario, hundreds of millions of people die. Worst case scenario, it drives mass extinction. Now, if that were to happen, you do want to figure out the best way to repel the comet. Let's say theoretically, even though it's traveling very fast, it's still far enough away that you have around 7 days, but it's very clearly on a trajectory for Earth. Okay, so yes, repelling the comet is something which, if you're an optimist, your burden of proof is, the scientists are wrong that the comet is going to hit us, or they're wrong that the impact will be that bad. We can weather the thing. There's no reason for us to try to expend any resources on repelling the comet from Earth. Now, I think this would not be a very tenable argument, and it would psychologically be much harder to convince people of, because if the comet's supposed to be 7 days away, something that imminent is something that people may be less willing to roll the dice on than a challenge that is much more long-term. On the other hand, the fatalist position would be basically that, look, nothing that we can do is a sure thing, and in fact, the probability is Y, and insert a very low probability for Y of anything working. So why bother? It's going to hit us anyway. And the survival instinct that has gotten us to this point, that has gotten humankind to this level of advanced civilization, that instinct is to always give something a chance, however low the odds might be, to at least try to avoid the worst case scenario. And again, on issues of survival, to really try to avoid as much premature death as possible. That is a survival instinct. Now, how high? That's why what the fatalists have to basically prove is that the odds are so non-existent, the odds of any avoidance of the worst scenario, that the odds are so non-existent that it warrants us sitting back and doing nothing. Even if there is a chance that by doing something we could lessen the harm that we're going to deal with. So currently, to that end, trying to prove non-existent odds of doing anything, there are really two main issues that are at stake here. One is the issue of positive feedback loops, and the second is the issue of negative emissions. So on the question of positive feedback loops, it is true that once we drive up temperatures by emitting greenhouse gases, there are a number of regional climate systems that react to higher temperatures by doing things that raise temperatures even further. Arctic sea ice is a very well understood positive feedback loop. As it melts, there is less and less of the Arctic sea that reflects sunlight back into the atmosphere, and in some cases out of the atmosphere. More of the sunlight remains trapped on Earth when the sea gets darker, when there are fewer and fewer ice packs to reflect sunlight. Permafrost melt causes methane and carbon dioxide that is trapped in the Siberian permafrost to enter the atmosphere, acidifying oceans, and oceans that currently contain a great deal of greenhouse gases can eventually release those greenhouse gases. That becomes likelier and likelier the more we put into them. And once they release those gases, then our atmosphere has much more. Because consider this, every second we put out 4 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs worth of heat into the atmosphere. But the vast majority of that heat is not retained in the atmosphere. The vast majority of it, around, I think, 55%, which isn't that vast, goes into the ocean. So all of those accumulated gases that are in the ocean could eventually begin to be released into the atmosphere. And then you have a number of other feedback loops, potentially either the transformation of the Amazon rainforest into a temperate forest, or the transformation of the Amazon rainforest into a desert. The various dieback scenarios. And so there are a number of different feedback loops that are happening all around the world. We have varying levels of knowledge about these. We have a lot of knowledge about the Arctic sea ice. We have much less knowledge, for instance, about the boreal forest and what might be going on there. But the fatalist position is basically this. Number one, it's very easy to trigger feedback loops. We've already triggered some of them. We have reached various, if there isn't one tipping point, we have probably reached a few of them. James Hansen said that we would reach a tipping point once we got to 1 degree of warming. We're currently at 0.87 degrees of warming. And since temperatures lag behind emissions, we're certain to go way above 1 degree. Moreover, a lot of these feedback loops are triggered when global temperatures are between 1 and 3 degrees. Some of them are triggered between 3 to 5 degrees, and some at above 5 degrees Celsius. Then you have to factor in that within different regional climate systems, we already have different levels of warming. So, for instance, and this was a very surprising thing, but just today I read that Siberian permafrost isn't only melting, but this year we're seeing so many freakish wildfires in Siberia in May. Partly because part of the Siberian permafrost is technically in the Arctic region, but there's a polar vortex this year which is really cutting off the lower latitudes of the Arctic Circle from the winter freeze that they usually experience. So you have a number of so a very large tract of land in Siberia had a very unusually mild winter and is now experiencing a very unusually hot spring, so that the overall temperatures are about already 3 degrees Celsius above average in Siberia. And even more remarkably, the aggregate temperatures in Russia are currently 6 degrees Celsius above average compared to what they usually would be at this time of year. And when you consider that some of the absolute worst scenarios with climate change, the ones that are so bad that they haven't even been studied as well, center around 6 degrees Celsius warming for the whole planet. Well, we're certainly nowhere near there at this point, but the pessimists and the fatalists would say, look, we have these feedback loops. They're already in motion. They cascade off of each other. They build off of each other. And at this point, it's already uncontrollable. But there are a few problems with these assertions. Firstly, even though there is much of climate that we do understand, and even though it's very clear, for instance, that scientists have made predictions that have come true. Scientists predicted the overall trajectory of temperatures, and those predictions have unfortunately borne fruit. We have seen the 0.87 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures since the pre-industrial age. That has happened up to this point. There were predictions about 20 years ago that in 20 years, Australia would see continental wildfires. Incidentally, wildfires are also a feedback loop, obviously. As we get hotter and as drier areas get drier and hotter, wildfires increase in intensity and frequency. And when that happens, trees that store up carbon dioxide, not only do they burn, and the very burning itself, there was a weird dragonfly a moment ago, burning itself releases carbon, and then add to that these trees have stored a lot of carbon in their lifetimes, and the minute that they die, they release a great deal of carbon. And I'm speaking, as a layman, and I'm probably, when I say the minute that they die, I might technically be wrong, but as trees die, they release a lot of carbon dioxide. And so this is one kind of positive feedback loop, which is, in reality, it's very negative because it makes things much worse. But the thing is that there's a lot that we need to learn about feedback loops. And one of the other things that fatalists will argue is that not only are feedback loops a problem, but one of our best instruments to undoing the damage that we have is not going to, that since we don't currently know that, for instance, building negative emissions is something that's scalable, it just won't be scalable. And the problem with that is, without overstating this, because even though we've gone a long way with renewables, there's much further that we can do. There's much more that we need to do, and there's much more that needs to be basically mandated, for lack of a better term, on a policy level. But we have seen enormous progress with renewables. We've seen a dramatic drop in the prices of renewable energies and renewable technologies, and we've also seen a dramatic rise in their usage. Similarly, we may see the same developments with negative emissions technologies, BECS systems, carbon capture and storage systems, ranging from artificial trees planted in deserts to suck up carbon dioxide and other emissions, and also from that to potentially artificial volcanoes. And you have different levels of geoengineering, some of which we definitely need to learn more about, which definitely should be regulated at an international level by some kind of convention on the use of geoengineering, since no one country should unilaterally be able to do something that impacts everyone else as dramatically as geoengineering. But the point is that on the one hand, we should never count on negative emissions, and we should reduce emissions as much as we can without simply assuming, we can reduce less because we'll have negative emissions later. On the other hand, the idea that that there is no damage that we have already done that can be undone is one which is misleading, since we already do have a number of these technologies that have already been developed, and it's really a matter of making them more scalable, making them more cost-effective, making it more feasible for a more widespread use of those technologies. And so that's a big part of the problem with the fatalist position. Another big problem with the fatalist position is kind of related to the feedback loop issue, is the question of climate sensitivity. To reiterate, we're very certain about certain things. We are very certain that climate is sensitive to emissions, and that higher emissions lead to higher temperatures. Sometimes the details of that are a little bit less clear, and what we have at this point are a range of outcomes that happen from every different concentration of emissions. So whenever people say, we've built in precisely this amount of momentum, and we've done exactly this much damage, and what we have done up to this point leads to X temperatures. Even when there is, obviously we need to look at the science behind every claim, and there might be better research behind one claim and better modeling behind one claim than another. But let's remember that climate sensitivity is something that involves a range of outcomes, and therefore, yes, certain things are unattainable. When we're deciding what the floor is, what is the best case scenario if we stop emitting tomorrow? Let's say that tomorrow we get to net zero emissions. What's the best case scenario and what's the worst case scenario? Here's the thing, and I'm not trying to hide this, I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. Back in 2009, they did a study on this, Solomon et al. And what they found was that, if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, and we lost the chance to do that because that was 11 years ago, but if we stopped in 2009, that would have meant 45 years of temperatures continuing to go up, due to feedback loops, due to momentum, due to all of the, it takes a while for temperatures to rise to their highest height from any final concentration of greenhouse gases. So they found it would take 45 years. Temperatures would continue rising. They would stabilize, certainly at a level that's higher than pre-industrial, certainly at a level that's higher than what we have today, and much higher than what we had in 2009. The sooner that we stop, the sooner temperatures reach that equilibrium, and the lower that equilibrium will be. But once we reach that equilibrium, it'll be about at least 1,000 years. Certainly nothing that we will experience in our lifetimes until temperatures decline at all. So that's a very bleak scenario from the National Academy of the Sciences, Solomon et al., 2009. And then 2 years later, you had another study from the National Research Council, 2011, Climate Stabilization. What this study found was something even bleaker, although it was under a bleaker scenario. So the scenario is, instead of stopping emissions in 2009, by 2011 that was impossible. Let's suppose that instead we stop emitting greenhouse gases in 2050. But let's suppose that up until 2050, we continue going at the same rate. Now, this is a very interesting theoretical scenario because it's, among other things, it's impossible, right? The only way that we get to zero at any year, whether it's 2050, 2044, 2035, whatever year we get to zero at, or 2033, 2032, 2030, well, whatever year you wanna fix as the end date where we no longer emit anything as a planet, what that would mean is obviously that global emissions would have to peak long before then, and they would have to be reduced year on year for a pretty long and sustained period of time. So the idea that we do exactly what we're doing now and then get to zero in 2050 is not something that's possible. But at any rate, what this study found was that if we continue doing what we're doing until mid-century and somehow flip a switch and stop doing it in mid-century, we wouldn't see 45 years of temperatures going up after we've stopped. We would see thousands of years of temperatures continuing to rise. Now, the thing is that both of these studies did not factor in the potential for negative emissions technologies or the potential for geoengineering. And so both of these studies are saying, okay, look, carbon dioxide lasts a very long time in the atmosphere. Solomon et al. Found that 40% of the carbon that we put into the atmosphere will still be there 1,000 years from now. So that means that it lasts longer, and that more of it lasts for 1,000 years than radioactive waste. But the essential point is that even these bleakest of studies show different outcomes depending on what we do. Stopping emissions in 2009 would lead to one much smaller amount of time, 45 years, of temperatures continuing to rise because of all the momentum we've baked into the system, without even accounting for the potential of negative emissions to undo some of that. Emissions continuing at the same rate to 2050 and then stopping would lead to thousands of years, according to the National Research Council. Thousands of years of temperatures not only being above where they are now, but continuing to rise. So these are two different impacts based on actions that we take. Feedback loops take thousands of years to take full effect. Many of them are clearly already underway. The idea that they inevitably continue to cascade off each other, regardless of what emissions inputs we are putting into the system, is one which requires much more evidence than it currently has. We need a much better understanding of climate sensitivity. We need a much better understanding of these feedback loops and of any inability to stop them once they've already started. Moreover, lower thresholds for passing, quote, the tipping point, even though we're dealing with many tipping points, have a few other problems. You have the issue that even one of the studies that argues that we are very imminently passing the point of no return was called Hothouse Earth. And somebody else who looked at feedback loops, another scientist who looked at feedback loops, Richard Betts, pointed out that the Hothouse Earth study was not as devastating as some articles have portrayed it. Where, for instance, Hothouse Earth, the study itself by William Steffen and Jim Steffen and Timothy M. Lenton, this study, in its own words, said that the 2-degree threshold for triggering all of these feedback loops was a risk-averse threshold. And another thing to keep in mind about feedback loops is that the literature on feedback loops is often very self-referential. And this is according to someone who has studied feedback loops. According to climate scientist Richard Betts, these studies tend to cite each other. They tend to be literature reviews that cite other literature reviews, and up until now have not been based on modeling. So we can debate about exactly where the floor is. We can debate about exactly where the threshold is. I think that wherever the lowest temperatures might be, based on what we do now, should be our ambition. High ambition should mean doing everything that we can to reach the best scenario possible. Simply saying, when we frame high ambition as being 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are a number of problems with that. We might be able to reach a target like that. We might have already made that impossible. We might have even made a 2 degrees Celsius target impossible. We don't know. We do know that the IEA was making different projections before the Paris Accords than afterwards. Before the Paris Accords, the International Energy Agency, which has a very conservative reputation, but the IEA was projecting that temperatures would go up by 6 degrees Celsius in this century, an outcome that we're already beginning to see in Russia. So it's certainly a plausible outcome, even if it's one of the higher end estimates. That was the average estimate that the IEA was making in 2011, in 2014, in many instances before the Paris Accords. In 2019, the IEA was projecting that when you account for the commitments that countries have made, and even when you account for some of the backsliding that we've seen since countries have made commitments in Paris, global temperatures are on track to rise 3.2 degrees, or 2.7 degrees if countries adapt the most stringent measures that they committed to. So that's a very different outcome than 6 degrees Celsius. We could certainly wind up much closer to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century if there is more backsliding and if more countries walk away from their Paris commitments. But this is already an instance where collective action has arguably has arguably reduced the harm that we would have experienced. It is not climate success in the sense that it's a mission accomplished. It's nowhere close to that. But this is one case where there's a pretty good argument that steps we did take did set us on a better trajectory than we otherwise would be on. And so the final thing to consider is the nature of survival. And I touched on this a little bit earlier. But the nature of survival is not always a question of, okay, how do we make sure we have, should we do something to try to survive if the odds of survival are, if the odds of survival, even once we've done the best that we could, remain perilously low. However low those might be, the human survival instinct is to do whatever we can to increase the odds of survival. And if we're looking at, by the way, this is addressing the fatalist argument. So looking at, this is based on the most pessimistic understanding of climate change. And just to be clear, when the IEA is projecting that due to the Paris Climate Accords, we are on track, on average, to see a 3.2 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures in this century, that is a very dangerous level of climate change. It is not necessarily existential. It certainly increases the risk of positive feedbacks above where it is today, and it increases the risk of something that's uncontrollable, and of something that could get much worse. And that it's a projection that looks at 2100. It doesn't look at 2200 or 2300, when the risk could be much more existential. And it also is assuming that we continue doing the few things that we are already doing, and that is by no means a safe assumption. But again, even when we look at the most pessimistic understanding of the situation, we have to reach a very high burden of proof before we decide that we won't even try to reduce the worst impacts, that we won't even try to make the situation better than it could be. And finally, again, to go back to the point of high ambition and how we redefine it, we have to understand that at every degree, we're looking at vastly different outcomes. So according to the National Research Council study that I've cited a few times in this video, every degree that temperatures rise leads to a 5 to 10% increase in rainfall in areas that already have a lot of rainfall, and a 5 to 10% reduction in rainfall in areas that don't. Now that those sound like small numbers, 1 degree, 5 to 10%. NASA looked at the difference of half a degree between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. And one of their findings was that for just that half a degree difference, we see 61 million more people exposed to severe drought, 61 million more people in urban areas exposed to severe drought by 2100. And that's half a degree. So that 5 to 10% for every 1 degree, and what that may mean is double the differences that NASA and the IPCC found for half a degree. In fact, NASA was citing IPCC. So think about that. Every degree might be a matter of 120 million more people exposed to severe drought. Not only people living in remote parts of the world, but even people living in very highly populated urban areas. The social stressors from that, the cost in human life, and the effects on fragile states around the world, the effects on migration. These effects are really monumental in scope for every degree of difference. And therefore, we have an obligation to keep things, to always keep the situation at the lowest level of harm that we can. It's an obligation to ourselves. It is in our mutual self-interest as people living on this planet. And it's a moral obligation to future generations and to people in the most vulnerable parts of the world that have the fewest resources to deal with the problem. We have to make sure that adaptation is feasible. Simply adapting without reducing emissions is not a feasible future. So, for all of these reasons, even if you take the pessimistic view, and I understand where it's coming from, succumbing to fatalism is something that really has a very high burden of proof. And it's a high burden of proof you have to meet to, I don't want to be too heavy-handed about it, but it's a high burden of proof that you sort of owe to us and that you sort of owe to everyone else. And I understand why you feel dejected, and I understand where it's coming from, and I even have done my best to understand the bleakest scientific literature and the bleakest modeling that informs your perspective. But we would need to know much more in order to adopt your perspective. And look, if we ever do, if it ever does become clear that the situation is beyond hope and that there is nothing that we can do, obviously, the position you currently hold is one that we should adopt, because we have to do whatever the science says, and there would be no use in trying to minimize the harm if the harm is beyond minimizing, and if we know that, but we don't know that, and there is reason to believe that we have not reached that particular point of no return, even if we have passed a few others. Some form of climate change will be with us. But there is ample reason to believe that that level of warming is something that we still have a great deal of control over, provided we have the will to exert it. On that note, I'll close.